Soy Podcast. Welcome to the show with us. I am joining with Dale D. from Grain Cycles out of Bloomington, Illinois. Dale is a commodity analysis and retired commodity broker in Central Illinois. How are you today? Welcome to the show with us for today, Dale.
It's good to be here and be online with you, Cesar.
Let's start with November's report. Could you tell to the audience about it?
Well, both the corn and soybean yields, corn in particular, came in higher than what the trade was looking at. I tend to look at internal details of USDA reports. As we know, they provide ear counts and pod counts depending on which crop you're looking at. And the one thing I noticed in looking at the November data for soybeans is that it appeared, much of the increase in production on a national basis came outside those 11 major producing states that they go out and actually measure data in the field. For corn, the unusual thing I noticed is that the implied ear weight, and this is basically an implied number. It's not a measured number, but it takes into account the yield for the individual states and the ear count numbers we get for those states. And you can come up with a weighted number for the 10 states on corn in determining, what kind of ear weight is implied. And that includes both the data from what they collect in the field, but also data from the farmer survey. So it's not an actual ear weight. But the one thing notable in November is that there was a fairly significant jump in ear weight, and that is somewhat unusual.
What about cattle on feed report? Could you tell to the cattle farmer and ranchers?
Well, the one thing, and I know we've got a cattle on feed report coming up, and people are looking for placements to be higher again. The one we had a month ago, placements were a little bit heavier than what they expected, and I think what's happening is that from a supply standpoint, we're probably seeing the price pull, especially the price of cattle, but also the price of corn, helping pull those available feeder animals into the feedlot at this particular moment. Still weather in some western areas could be playing a part, but I don't think it's necessarily a big part. But with if the on-feed numbers come up higher again than we were a year ago, it's going to tend to indicate that the number of cattle coming out of the feed yards here especially as we get into the early part of 2024, could be heavier than what people think. I think the bigger issue, though, that when we look at the cattle/beef market is, are we finding beef prices at the retail level and even looking at the wholesale level, as far as looking at the restaurant trade itself, are we finding some pushback and some diminishment of demand for beef?
I heard that the cattle herd, it's going to be bigger overnight. Do you agree?
Well, I don't. If we're pulling more numbers of cattle into the feed yard, I don't think the herd's going to be bigger overnight. I haven't really done much looking at the cattle numbers as far as considering the inventory number we'll get for January 1. That'll come in January. I don't think it's going to show us that we've had any expansion in cattle numbers this last year, but I also don't think necessarily it's going to show any market deterioration in it, except maybe in those areas where weather was still somewhat of a problem through the summer months themselves. And grass was not great, and or hay prices being somewhat high. So, but I don't know that our cattle number January 1 is going to be markedly different than it was a year ago. And I'm looking basically at cattle numbers, not considering the feeders and or calf crop.
How are the grain market for today's close?
Well, market's been a little defensive so far this week. I guess I'm a little bit surprised, but then again, probably somewhat of a reaction to what we had on Monday as being a fairly unexpected surge in prices again. When I stop and I look at what's going on right now, I really kind of look at South America. And I think it's going to play out in the corn and the bean markets in two different ways. What's going on in South America could have some implications as far as looking at production coming out of Brazil. Everybody's penciling in, at least at this point, Argentina should be higher than we were a year ago. Certainly not something into the mid 50 million ton really good crops that we've seen, but we've got talks still that we can do a middle to high 40 million ton bean crop there. Brazil, a lot of people had penciled in something around 163 million ton. I even heard a few at 165. But I'm finding quite a few people, especially a few contacts I've got down in Brazil itself, starting to ratchet back and thinking if rain across the northern producing states, and that's really where it's been dry, is probably going to, or I should say possibly going to ratchet that back to somewhere in the high 150 million ton area. And depending on weather as we unfold in the growing season, could be more. We're seeing some soybean replanting done already. Some of these acres are being replanted to cotton and not going back to beans, cotton being a more of a dry land, dry weather type crop. And probably the real big concern on a lot of people with the planting being pushed back a little bit, seeing some replanting of beans being done generally argues that the beans themselves could get harvested a little late, and the downside of the beans getting harvested a little late really starts to draw into question how many acres of second crop corn will we have down in Brazil this year. That's an answer to be questioned as we go through the early middle part of the winter months themselves. But I think it's one that we've got to focus on, because if they don't plant as many acres of corn second crop this year, and if weather would be somewhat normal even, and in the delays, we could certainly see that reduce that second crop output, and would be a bit of a plus for our corn market as we get on into the spring period.
Not really good, unfortunately, our friend in Brazil and Argentina.
Yeah, it's somewhat unfortunate for them. It's having El Nino weather problems down there isn't necessarily unusual, but this one seems to be across the northern areas, maybe at this time a little bit more stressful with moisture conditions and rainfall totals tending to be lighter than even we get in a lot of El Nino years. Then you get into
markets and hogs markets.
Well, the cattle market, I've heard some commentary from some people here, and I don't follow cattle and the hogs as much as I do the grains, but I'm hearing some people wondering, because of the exuberance we had in the cattle market back, in the summer and even into the fall, that we might have gotten next April cattle, for example, a little bit ahead of itself. And even though some people expect cattle prices to rebound as they normally do somewhat as we head from the holidays on into towards our spring months, there's some people that are thinking that, there's a possibility that April cattle futures, for example, might have already seen their contract highs with the high we had a year ago. And I think part of this is coming back simply because of the uneasiness a lot of people have with signs that, the economy is softening a little bit, and concern about high grocery prices at this point in time could diminish demand for beef in particular because it's high priced relative to both pork and poultry. So I think even though, we'll see some resilience in the market once we get through the holidays and see some stronger movement in cattle prices, I'm starting to think that, we are not going to perform maybe quite as well as what we did last year.
Finally, what is your opinion on the corn yields for this year in central Illinois near Bloomington and I-74 corridor?
Well, there was a variety of corn yields depending on where you were, like everybody was, on whether it was some haves and have-nots. I tended to notice as I was traveling around during the summer months, as I affectionately say, I didn't hear quite as many bumblebees as I usually do. And what I'm really addressing there is people spraying their crops with fungicides, part of that being somewhat dry, which fungal diseases don't tend to be quite as much of a problem. And I think with the break we had in corn prices, people tended to abandon it. So that might have undermined yield potential just a little bit. I think overall, central Illinois, maybe good average yields, but I wouldn't say anything better than that, necessarily. As you get into the eastern part of the state, they had some dryness issues early on, which I think probably tended to diminish their yields a little bit too.
Is there anything would you like to go to tell the audience about the cash market for central Illinois?
Well, as well as doing a lot of fundamental work in the markets as I did through my whole career, and I, like many people that got in this business, got into it with a strong fundamental background, but I use some technical work to try to clarify, what I'm seeing fundamentally, or to dismiss sometimes. But one thing I really noticed, and I use price cycles, is that the lows we had in beans here back a month or a month and a half ago, to me were good candidates to be both a 32-week low and maybe a 3-year low in the bean market themselves. So I tend to see cash bean prices as having some strength. If I'm looking at nearby futures, soon to be the January contract, I think we got a shot at seeing January futures get up somewhere between 14 and maybe even as high as 14 and a half. So I'm a little bit optimistic on beans. The corn's a little bit more difficult. The biggest thing I can say at this point is I'm really not bearish corn, but it may be a market, especially when we delve into some of the fundamental things. It takes some time to get a head of steam underway. And so we may go through the rest of this calendar year having a bit of a volatile market, sideways mostly, might start to garner a little bit of strength, but nothing big. And with corn, I've got, by my counts, a 40-week low that's due somewhere right after first of the year. So maybe it's going to be any meaningful strength in corn prices really don't have a chance to emerge until after then. But right now, when I look at the flat cash price, I just don't see a lot of downside risk at this time.
My pleasure that you joined the show for today. What an honor that you joined our show.
Well, it's been good talking to you, Caesar, and I was not real sure how all this was going to work out, but you seem to have this kind of a method down to working real well for you. So I congratulate you, and it's been a pleasure to be here and talking with you.